The brilliant yellow chalk dust coated Maya's small hands, a cheerful counterpoint to the determined frown of concentration on her face. She was meticulously outlining a giant sunflower on the smooth gray expanse of their driveway, its petals reaching almost to the edge of the lawn. Each sweep of the chunky chalk was filled with purpose, her tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth as she focused on achieving the perfect curve. Her wheelchair, a lightweight model, adorned with a few well-loved stickers from her favorite animated movies, was positioned to give her optimal reach. This was her canvas, a temporary joyful explosion of color that would, she knew, wash away with the next rain. But for now, it was a masterpiece in progress. The late spring air was sweet with the scent of newly mown grass and the distant perfume of lilac bushes from a neighbor's yard. A robin trilled a cheerful song from the branches of the young maple tree her dad Liam had planted last fall. A sharp, disapproving cough shattered the peaceful tableau. Maya startled her hand jerking, sending a streak of yellow chalk skittering across a perfectly formed petal. She looked up to see Mrs. Carmichael, the formidable president of the Oak Haven Glen Homeowners Association, standing at the foot of their driveway. Mrs. Carmichael's arms were folded tightly across her chest, her lips pursed into a thin, hard line. In one hand, she clutched the thick, burgundy-bound HOA rulebook, its gold-embossed lettering glinting in the sunlight. It looked less like a guide for community living and more like a weapon. This Mrs. Carmichael declared, her voice as crisp and unforgiving as a starched collar, is an egregious violation of Oak Haven Glen Bylaw Article 7, Section 3, Paragraph C, prohibition of defacement or unauthorized markings on common or private property surfaces visible to the public right-of-way. Your driveway, young lady, is not a public billboard for juvenile graffiti. Maya's heart did a familiar, unhappy flip. It seemed that Mrs. Carmichael had a special talent for finding fault with anything that brought Maya even a sliver of joy. It's just chalk, Mrs. Carmichael. Maya explained, her voice barely a whisper. It washes off. It's not permanent. She gestured towards the half-finished sunflower, its bright promise suddenly seeming vulnerable. Mrs. Carmichael sniffed a sound of profound disdain. The temporary nature of the defacement is irrelevant, Miss O'Connell. It is the principle of maintaining aesthetic uniformity and upholding the visual standards of our community that is at stake. Oak Haven Glen will not be subjected to such unsightly and childish displays. She took a step closer, her shadow falling over Maya's artwork. Maya instinctively tried to maneuver her wheelchair back, but the slight incline made it a clumsy, awkward movement. Sometimes when Maya was anxious or upset, her body had a way of betraying her. A small tremor started in her left hand, and a tiny, involuntary squeak escaped her lips. It was part of the neurological condition that also confined her to the wheelchair, something she usually managed well, but stress always made it worse. Mrs. Carmichael's eyes narrowed a flicker of something cold and unpleasant in their depths. And kindly refrain from making those peculiar noises. It's most unseemly. Tears pricked at Maya's eyes. I can't always help it. She stammered, shame and frustration welling up inside her. Excuses are the refuge of the ill-disciplined. Mrs. Carmichael snapped her patience if she ever possessed any clearly exhausted. This community operates on rules, not on individual whims or unfortunate afflictions. You people seem to believe that your particular circumstances grant you a special dispensation to ignore the regulations that bind the rest of us. Her voice rose in pitch, laced with a venom that made Maya tremble. This blatant disregard for aesthetic propriety will cease immediately. Before Maya could react, before she could even process the cruelty of the woman's words, Mrs. Carmichael's anger boiled over. With a furious exclamation, "This is an outrage. Durtelm!" She lunged forward and brought the heavy, hard-cornered HOA rulebook down with vicious force, not on the chalk drawing, but directly onto Maya's outstretched hand, the one still holding the piece of yellow chalk. A cry of sharp, agonizing pain was torn from Maya's throat. The chalk shattered, a puff of yellow dust exploding into the air. She snatched her hand back, cradling it against her chest, tears instantly blurring her vision. The impact had been stunningly forceful, sending shockwaves of pain up her arm. "And that?" Mrs. Carmichael shrieked, her face flushed with rage, her eyes blazing. is for blatant defiance. She raised the book again as if to strike Maya's other hand, or perhaps her legs, which were an easy target. Carmichael, get away from my daughter now. The command was like a thunderclap, low resonant, and charged with an authority that stopped Mrs. Carmichael in mid-motion. Liam O'Connell. Maya's father was suddenly there, moving with a swift, controlled power that belied his usually easygoing demeanor. He had been on a conference call in his study, the window of which offered a clear view of the driveway. He'd seen the confrontation escalate, heard Maya's cry, and had been out of the house in seconds. He positioned himself squarely between Maya and the enraged HOA president, his body a protective barrier. His eyes, normally warm and crinkling at the corners with good humor, were now like chips of glacial ice. Chloe O'Connell, alerted by Maya's scream and Liam's roar, rushed out from the kitchen, her face etched with alarm. She saw Maya sobbing and clutching her hand, Liam confronting a wild-eyed Mrs. Carmichael, and the heavy rulebook still gripped in the woman's fist. Maya. Oh, my baby. What did she do to you? Chloe knelt beside her daughter, her gentle fingers prying at Maya's, revealing the angry red mark already blooming on the back of her small hand. Mrs. Carmichael, momentarily stunned by Liam's sudden appearance and the sheer force of his presence, began to sputter. She was deliberately defacing property. She was being insolent. And those noises. It's a violation of the peace. She needed to be taught a lesson about respecting rules. Liam's voice was dangerously soft, each word imbued with a chilling precision. You just assaulted a child, Carmichael, my child, with that book. He gestured curtly with his chin towards the HOA Handbook. And as a lead instructor in crisis intervention training for the city police department, I can assure you that what you just did constitutes battery aggravated assault on a minor, and quite possibly a hate crime given your discriminatory remarks about her disability. Vaio, he was already dialing 911 on his cell phone, his gaze never leaving Mrs. Carmichael's face. You are going to be arrested. The color drained from Mrs. Carmichael's face, replaced by a dawning realization that she had crossed a line from which there was no easy return. Her name was Patricia Carmichael, but from this day forward in the annals of Oakhaven, Glen she would be known simply as Karen. The heavy rulebook, her symbol of authority, suddenly seemed to weigh a ton in her trembling hand. It slipped from her grasp, landing with a dull thud on the concrete a few feet from Maya's vibrant, unfinished sunflower. The yellow chalk dust still hung in the air, a silent, glittering accusation. The O'Connell family, Liam, Chloe, and their bright, resilient 10-year-old daughter Maya, had chosen Oakhaven Glen with deliberate care. Liam, a highly respected lead instructor at the city's police academy, specialized in crisis intervention training, or CIT. His days were spent teaching officers how to de-escalate volatile situations, how to interact with individuals experiencing mental health crises, or those with developmental and intellectual disabilities, emphasizing empathy, communication, and the use of minimal force. His work was intense, demanding a unique blend of tactical skill, psychological insight, and profound compassion. He craved a peaceful sanctuary for his family, a place where the stresses of his job could recede. Chloe, his wife, was a passionate and articulate disability rights advocate. She ran a small but influential local nonprofit organization that provided support resources and advocacy services for families navigating the complexities of raising children with special needs. Her work was fueled by both her professional dedication and her deep, unwavering love for Maya. Maya herself was a whirlwind of creativity and determination. Born with a rare neurological condition that affected her motor control and confined her to a wheelchair, she also experienced occasional involuntary muscle spasms and vocalizations, especially when tired or stressed. Despite these challenges, Maya possessed an infectious optimism, a keen intellect, and a remarkable talent for art. Her drawings and paintings, full of vibrant color and imaginative creatures, adorned every room of their home. Her wheelchair was not a prison, but a chariot, taking her on adventures limited only by her boundless imagination. Oakhaven Glen, with its mature trees, well-maintained homes, and reputation for being a family-friendly community, with a highly rated elementary school that boasted an inclusive special education program, had seemed like the perfect fit. They had purchased a modest but charming single-story home that Liam and Chloe had painstakingly adapted to be fully accessible for Maya, complete with wide doorways, a roll-in shower, and a custom-built ramp that blended seamlessly with their landscaping. Their initial interactions with Patricia Carmichael, the long-standing and seemingly omnipotent president of the Oak Haven Glen Homeowners Association, had been deceptively cordial. Mrs. Carmichael, a woman whose perfectly coiffed silver hair and rigidly upright posture seemed to brook no dissent, had welcomed them with a brittle smile and a weighty copy of the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Liam and Chloe, veterans of community living, had perused the document, noting the usual litany of rules regarding lawn care, exterior paint colors, and holiday decorations, assuming them to be largely standard, if somewhat overzealous. The first hint that Mrs. Carmichael's interpretation of these rules might become problematic, particularly concerning Maya, had surfaced a few months after they moved in. Maya, with Liam's help, had installed a custom-built adaptive swing in their backyard. It was a sturdy, safe design, allowing Maya to experience the simple joy of swinging, an activity most children took for granted. The swing set was positioned in a corner of their yard, partially visible over the 6-foot privacy fence from certain angles on the street behind their property. A week after its installation, a crisply typed letter on Oak Haven Glen HOA letterhead arrived, signed by Patricia Carmichael. It stated that the unapproved recreational apparatus was in violation of a bylaw regarding permanent yard structures exceeding 4 feet in height without prior written consent from the Architectural Review Committee. It further mentioned that some residents, a phrase Liam and Chloe would come to recognize as Carmichael code for I, had expressed concerns about its visual impact on the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony and potential noise disturbances. Liam had responded politely, explaining the therapeutic and recreational importance of the swing for Maya, providing documentation of its safety features, and assuring Mrs. Carmichael that it was used only during reasonable daylight hours. He respectfully requested a retroactive approval or a clear explanation of how an adaptive swing for a disabled child could be deemed a visual blight or a noise disturbance. Mrs. Carmichael's reply had been swift and chillingly dismissive. The Oak Haven Glen Homeowners Association strives to maintain a consistent and high-quality aesthetic that benefits all residents and protects property values. Individual needs, however understandable, cannot be permitted to supersede the established architectural and community standards. The request for approval is denied. The structure must be removed within 30 days to avoid further enforcement action, including daily fines. There was no mention of therapeutic need, no acknowledgement of disability, just a cold, unyielding adherence to her interpretation of the rules. Chloe had been incandescent with rage. She's targeting Maya Liam. This isn't about a swing set. It's about her not wanting anything or anyone different in her perfect little kingdom. Liam, drawing on his CIT training, had tried to de-escalate. He'd requested a meeting with Mrs. Carmichael and the Architectural Review Committee, which they soon discovered consisted of Mrs. Carmichael and 2 of her close friends, who invariably rubber-stamped her decisions. The meeting had been a frustrating exercise in futility. Mrs. Carmichael had listened with a veneer of polite attention, as Liam and Chloe explained Maya's needs and their rights under fair housing laws regarding reasonable accommodations for disabilities. Then she had simply reiterated her position, her tone condescending, her argument circular. "Rules are for everyone, Mr. O'Connell. We cannot make exceptions, or where would it end?" The swing set dispute had eventually been resolved, but only after Liam had reluctantly threatened legal action, citing specific ADA and Fair Housing Act statutes. Mrs. Carmichael had backed down, but not gracefully, issuing a grudging one-time variance that dripped with resentment. The incident had left a bitter taste, a clear indication that their life in Oak Haven Glen would be a constant battle against an HOA president who seemed to view their daughter not as a child, but as a problem to be managed, an inconvenient deviation from her rigid, intolerant worldview. The assault with the HOA Handbook over Maya's chalk art was not an isolated incident, but a terrifying escalation of a prejudice that had been simmering beneath the surface from the very beginning. The immediate aftermath of Patricia Carmichael's arrest was a chaotic blur of flashing police lights, the concerned murmurs of neighbors who had gathered at a safe distance, and the calm, professional ministrations of the paramedics who attended to Maya. Officer Miller, the primary responding officer, a young competent woman who recognized Liam from a CIT seminar he'd conducted for her precinct just a few months earlier, handled the situation with efficiency and sensitivity. Maya's hand was already swelling, a purplish bruise beginning to bloom beneath her delicate skin. The paramedics gently cleaned and bandaged a small abrasion where a corner of the heavy book had broken the skin. More concerning to Liam and Chloe, however, was Maya's emotional state. She was quiet, almost unnervingly, so her eyes wide and haunted her small body, trembling in Chloe's arms. The involuntary tics and vocalizations that sometimes accompanied her distress were more pronounced, a heartbreaking testament to the trauma she had endured. Mrs. Carmichael, despite her initial shock at Liam's professional identification, had quickly reverted to indignant bluster as she was being escorted to the patrol car. "This is an outrage, a complete misunderstanding. I am the president of this homeowners association. That child was deliberately provoking me, defacing property, and her noises. It's a constant disturbance. You can't arrest me for upholding community standards." Her shrill protests, however, fell on deaf ears. Officer Miller simply read her rights and secured her in the back of the vehicle. Liam, after ensuring Maya was in the care of Chloe and the paramedics, gave Officer Miller a concise, factual statement, his voice devoid of emotion, detailing what he had witnessed, Mrs. Carmichael's discriminatory language, and the physical assault. He provided the names of a few neighbors who had been outside and might have seen parts of the incident. He also handed over the HOA Handbook, now officially evidence. Patricia Carmichael was booked on charges of battery on a minor and assault with a deadly weapon, the thick, hard-bound rulebook, when used in such a manner, clearly qualifying. She spent the night in a holding cell, a stark and humiliating contrast to her meticulously maintained Oak Haven Glen residence. The following morning, her lawyer, a slick and notoriously aggressive defense attorney named Wallace Finch, managed to secure her release on bail. Finch immediately launched a public relations offensive, issuing a statement to the local press and flooding community social media forums with a carefully crafted narrative. In Finch's telling, Mrs. Carmichael was the victim, a dedicated community leader who had been verbally assaulted and physically threatened by Liam O'Connell after she had politely requested that his daughter cease vandalizing community visible property. The injury to Maya's hand, the statement ludicrously claimed, was the result of the child tripping and falling onto the discarded rulebook after her father's aggressive intervention. Liam's status as a police instructor was spun as evidence of his intimidating tactics and abuse of authority. The O'Connell family found themselves at the center of a storm. While many neighbors, horrified by the news of the assault on a disabled child, reached out with messages of support, offers of help, and shared stories of their own negative encounters with Mrs. Carmichael's tyranny, a vocal minority amplified by Finch's misinformation campaign rallied to Carmichael's defense. These were typically longtime residents who benefited from Carmichael's control, shared her rigid views, or were simply too afraid to challenge her. Suddenly, Liam and Chloe were not just dealing with the trauma of their daughter's assault, but also with a vicious smear campaign designed to discredit them and justify Karen's actions. Anonymous, hateful comments appeared online questioning their parenting, mocking Maya's disability, and accusing them of trying to play the victim card to get away with breaking rules. Mrs. Carmichael, far from being subdued by her arrest, returned to Oak Haven Glen with a vengeance. Barred by a temporary restraining order from direct contact with the O'Connell family, she instead used the full weight of the HOA apparatus to make their lives miserable. The violation notices, which had been sporadic before, now arrived with alarming frequency, targeting every conceivable aspect of their property and Maya's existence. The custom-built ramp, previously granted a grudging variance, was suddenly cited for unspecified structural deficiencies and improper aesthetic integration with the primary dwelling, accompanied by a demand for a new engineering report and architectural review at the O'Connell's expense. The adaptive swing set long. A settled issue was resurrected as a persistent source of noise complaints from multiple residents. Complaints that Liam and Chloe knew were fabricated by Carmichael and her cronies, and a visual blight on the neighborhood's sylvan character. More cruelly, Carmichael began to target services essential for Maya's well-being. She orchestrated an HOA resolution, passed by her compliant board, imposing new, highly restrictive rules on commercial vehicle access and parking within Oak Haven Glen, effectively making it difficult for Maya's physical therapist, who made home visits, and the paratransit service that sometimes transported Maya to specialized medical appointments to access their property. Deliveries of Maya's medical supplies were suddenly being misdirected or delayed, with delivery drivers reporting confusion and obstruction from an officious woman claiming to represent the HOA. The most chilling escalation, however, was Carmichael's attempt to weaponize the HOA's insurance policy. Through her lawyer, she formally requested that the HOA's master insurance carrier conduct a risk assessment of the O'Connell property, alleging that Maya's unpredictable condition and specialized equipment posed an undue liability risk to the association and its members. The implicit threat was clear: if the insurer deemed them a high risk, their homeowner's insurance could be impacted, or the HOA could try to levy exorbitant special assessments against them. It was a sophisticated, insidious form of harassment designed to financially cripple them and drive them out. Maya, acutely aware of the tension and hostility surrounding her, became increasingly withdrawn and anxious. Her art, once a source of unbridled joy, now lay untouched. She was afraid to play in her own yard, constantly looking over her shoulder, her small face etched with a worry that no child should ever have to bear. The involuntary tics and vocalizations became more frequent, more pronounced, creating a vicious cycle of stress and symptom exacerbation. Chloe and Liam watched their hearts breaking as their vibrant, resilient daughter began to fade before their eyes, a casualty of one woman's obsessive hatred and a community's complicity or fear. The fight for justice for Maya was no longer just about a single act of violence. It was about reclaiming their daughter's childhood and their family's right to live in peace and safety. The constant barrage of HOA harassment, coupled with the insidious nature of Patricia Carmichael's attacks on Maya's essential services and their financial stability, pushed Liam to his breaking point. His CIT training emphasized de-escalation and understanding, but Carmichael seemed immune to reason her malice a bottomless well. He knew he had to do more than just defend. He had to go on the offensive to uncover the rot that allowed such a woman to wield so much unchecked power. He began by meticulously documenting every instance of harassment, every violation notice, every interaction with Carmichael or her proxies. He cross-referenced them with the HOA bylaws, city ordinances, and state and federal disability rights laws, building a comprehensive dossier of Carmichael's abuses. His police instincts told him that her level of control and vindictiveness often masked deeper issues or vulnerabilities. Chloe, meanwhile, threw herself into her advocacy work with renewed fervor, using her nonprofit's resources to research legal precedents for HOA overreach and discrimination against residents with disabilities. She connected with other disability rights organizations seeking advice and potential legal support. She also started a private online support group for Oak Haven Glen residents who felt intimidated by Carmichael, a space where people could share their experiences and concerns without fear of immediate retaliation. The response was initially hesitant, but gradually stories began to trickle in. Tales of arbitrary fines, public shaming, and Carmichael's dictatorial control over every aspect of community life. Liam's investigation took a more direct turn. He decided to look into the HOA's finances. As a homeowner, he was legally entitled to review the association's financial records. He submitted a formal written request for access to all financial statements, budgets, invoices, and contracts for the past 5 years. Carmichael, through the HOA's management company, a firm known to be entirely beholden to her, initially tried to stall, citing privacy concerns and the administrative burden of such a broad request. Liam, however, politely but firmly persisted, quoting the relevant state statutes and the HOA's own governing documents, setting a firm deadline for compliance. When the documents were finally grudgingly provided, a mountain of poorly organized files and confusing spreadsheets, Liam spent weeks poring over them, often late into the night after Maya was asleep. What he began to uncover was a pattern of financial mismanagement and questionable expenditures that went far beyond mere incompetence. There were significantly inflated invoices for routine landscaping services from a company, Glen Gardenscapes, that seemed to have an exclusive no-bid contract with Oak Haven Glen. Further investigation revealed that Glen Gardenscapes was a relatively new entity, and its registered owner was a cousin of Patricia Carmichael. There were also large, vaguely described payments allocated to community beautification projects, Phase 1, 2, and 3, with very little tangible evidence of any actual improvements corresponding to the substantial sums disbursed. The contracts for these projects were awarded to another opaque company, Oakhaven Enhancements LLC, whose listed address was merely a P.O. box. Most alarmingly, Liam discovered a consistent pattern of denial for any homeowner requests that involved even minor HOA expenditure for non-standard items, particularly anything related to accessibility modifications or individual homeowner improvements that didn't fit Carmichael's narrow aesthetic vision. These denials were always couched in terms of preserving community funds for essential maintenance and planned major projects. Yet the planned major projects remained perpetually undefined and uninitiated, while the essential maintenance costs seemed exorbitant. It appeared that Patricia Carmichael wasn't just a power-hungry tyrant obsessed with aesthetic uniformity. She was potentially using her position to enrich herself or her relatives, systematically blocking legitimate expenditures to create a slush fund under the guise of fiscal responsibility. Her vendetta against the O'Connells, and specifically their requests for reasonable accommodations for Maya, wasn't just about prejudice. It was about protecting her financial schemes. Any expenditure on accessibility, any deviation from her tightly controlled budget threatened to draw unwanted scrutiny to the HOA's coffers. The crucial piece of the puzzle fell into place when Chloe, through her advocacy network, was contacted by a former resident of Oakhaven Glen, a family named Peterson. The Petersons had a teenage son who used a prosthetic leg and had required certain minor modifications to common area pathways for safe access. They described a nightmarish 2-year battle with Patricia Carmichael, who had systematically blocked every request, buried them in bureaucratic red tape, and eventually subjected them to a similar campaign of harassment and escalating fines for unrelated trivial violations. They had finally given up selling their home, at a loss to escape her relentless persecution. They had initially attributed Carmichael's behavior solely to prejudice, but Liam's emerging financial findings cast their experience in a new, even more sinister light. Carmichael hadn't just wanted to drive them out because of their son's disability. She had wanted to avoid spending a single HOA dime on their legitimate needs, preserving those funds for her own questionable purposes. Liam now had a powerful, multi-pronged theory. Patricia Carmichael was driven by a toxic combination of deep-seated prejudice against those she perceived as different or imperfect, an insatiable lust for absolute control, and most damningly, a corrupt agenda to misappropriate HOA funds. The attack on Maya hadn't just been a spontaneous act of rage. It was the desperate lashing out of a petty dictator whose authority and potentially criminal enterprise were being threatened by a family who dared to stand up for their rights and their child's well-being. The fight had just become much bigger and far more dangerous. Armed with compelling evidence of financial irregularities and a pattern of discriminatory harassment, Liam and Chloe knew they had to bring Patricia Carmichael's reign to an end, not just for their own family's sake, but for the entire Oakhaven Glen community. The opportunity presented itself when Carmichael, perhaps feeling the heat of Liam's persistent inquiries into the HOA's finances, or maybe just seeking to consolidate her power and silence any remaining dissent, announced the annual Oakhaven Glen Homeowners Association meeting and board elections. Her agenda, as usual, was heavily weighted towards rubber-stamping her own initiatives, including a proposed significant increase in HOA dues, ostensibly for long-overdue major capital improvements, the same undefined projects Liam suspected were a front for her slush fund. The community clubhouse on the evening of the meeting was packed. The atmosphere was thick, with a mixture of apprehension, resentment, and a faint flickering ember of hope, largely kindled by the O'Connells' quiet but determined resistance. Patricia Carmichael sat at the head table, flanked by her usual coterie of compliant board members, her expression one of smug confidence. She clearly anticipated another routine ratification of her authority. Liam and Chloe O'Connell arrived with Maya, who, despite her anxiety, had insisted on being there. She held a small portfolio of her artwork, a silent statement of her identity and resilience. They had also invited Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, the family Carmichael had previously driven out, who had agreed to travel back to Oakhaven Glen to share their story. Several other residents, emboldened by Chloe's online support group and armed with their own documented grievances against Carmichael, were also present, a quiet but growing coalition of dissent. The meeting began with Carmichael's lengthy, self-congratulatory president's report, filled with glowing accounts of her fiscal stewardship and unwavering commitment to maintaining Oakhaven Glen's premier status. She then moved to the proposed budget and dues increase, painting a dire picture of crumbling infrastructure that required immediate costly attention. When she opened the floor for questions before the vote, Liam O'Connell was the first to stand. His voice was calm, measured, but carried an undeniable weight of authority that commanded the room's attention. "Mrs. Carmichael," he began, "before we vote on any budget or dues increase, I believe the homeowners of Oakhaven Glen deserve a full and transparent accounting of how our current funds have been managed, or rather mismanaged." He didn't raise his voice, but his words, backed by meticulously organized presentation boards he'd set up at the side of the room, landed like hammer blows. He detailed the no-bid contracts awarded to Glen Gardenscapes, revealing its ownership by Carmichael's cousin, and presenting comparative quotes from other local landscaping companies that were significantly lower. He exposed the vague, massively inflated invoices for the non-existent community beautification projects from Oakhaven Enhancements LLC, highlighting its P.O. Box address and lack of any discernible business history. He then contrasted these questionable expenditures with Carmichael's systematic denial of funds for legitimate homeowner needs, particularly those related to accessibility. "This isn't fiscal stewardship, Mrs. Carmichael." Liam declared, his gaze unwavering. "This is a pattern of potential fraud and self-enrichment at the expense of every homeowner in this community." A wave of murmurs and gasps swept through the room. Carmichael's face, initially flushed with anger at the interruption, began to pale. "These are baseless accusations, slanderous lies from a disgruntled individual with a personal vendetta," she retorted, her voice rising shrilly. At that point, Mrs. Peterson stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear as she recounted her family's ordeal. Carmichael's relentless harassment, the fabricated violations, and the denial of reasonable accommodations for her son, all because Liam now posited Carmichael didn't want to spend HOA money on anything that didn't benefit her or her schemes. Other residents then began to speak out one after another, sharing their own stories of Carmichael's arbitrary fines, her dictatorial control, her bullying tactics. The carefully constructed facade of community support for Patricia Carmichael crumbled in real time. Maya, watching her father speak with such courage and clarity, and hearing the stories of other families, felt a surge of her own quiet strength. During a lull, she held up one of her drawings, a bright, hopeful picture of children of all abilities, playing together in a beautiful, accessible park. Her voice, though soft, carried in the suddenly quiet room. "Everyone deserves to feel safe and happy in their home," she said simply, "and everyone deserves to have a swing." The direct, heartfelt words of a child, juxtaposed with the mounting evidence of Carmichael's corruption and cruelty, seemed to galvanize the room. The tide of opinion turned decisively against the HOA president. Carmichael, cornered and exposed, lost all semblance of composure. She launched into a furious, rambling tirade, accusing Liam of a conspiracy, attacking the Petersons, even disparaging Maya's artwork. "This community was fine before you people started causing trouble, demanding special treatment, questioning my authority. I built this community. I protected its standards." Her outburst only served to further alienate her from the horrified onlookers. It was then that two uniformed police officers, accompanied by a plainclothes detective Liam recognized from the city's economic crimes unit, entered the clubhouse. Liam, anticipating Carmichael's potential for a desperate, uncontrolled reaction, and having already presented his financial findings to the authorities earlier that week, had alerted them that he would be publicly presenting this information at the HOA meeting. The detective approached the podium. "Patricia Carmichael," he stated, his voice calm but firm, based on credible allegations and substantial evidence presented to the district attorney's office regarding potential embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud the Oakhaven Glen Homeowners Association. In addition to the outstanding charges of assault and battery on a minor, you are being placed under arrest. You need to come with us." Patricia Carmichael stared dumbfounded as the detective read her rights. The fight seemed to drain out of her, replaced by a look of utter disbelief and despair. The symbol of her power, the HOA presidency, had become the instrument of her downfall. As she was escorted from the clubhouse, the residents of Oakhaven Glen, so long silenced by her tyranny, erupted not in cheers, but in a collective sigh of profound, exhausted relief. The reign of Karen was finally over. The arrest of Patricia Carmichael at the annual HOA meeting sent shockwaves through Oak Haven Glen and became a cautionary tale in the wider community. The charges against her were extensive and serious, not only the initial assault and battery on Maya, but now multiple counts of felony embezzlement, wire fraud conspiracy, and breach of fiduciary duty related to her mismanagement of the Homeowners Association funds. Her carefully constructed empire of petty tyranny and financial deceit had crumbled spectacularly. The Oak Haven Glen HOA was thrown into immediate turmoil, but it was a turmoil that quickly gave way to constructive action. An interim board was immediately elected from among the residents who had bravely spoken out at the meeting, including Mr. Peterson, who, despite his family's past trauma, felt a responsibility to help rebuild the community he had once been forced to flee. Liam O'Connell, though he modestly declined a formal board position, agreed to serve as an advisor, lending his expertise in procedure and ethical governance. The legal proceedings against Patricia Carmichael were lengthy and complex. Her high-priced lawyer, Wallace Finch, attempted every legal maneuver imaginable to discredit the evidence and portray Carmichael as a misunderstood victim of a vindictive smear campaign. However, the sheer weight of the financial documentation Liam had uncovered, corroborated by forensic accountants appointed by the district attorney's office, combined with the powerful testimonies of the O'Connell family, the Petersons, and numerous other Oak Haven Glen residents who had suffered under her arbitrary rule, proved insurmountable. Patricia Carmichael was found guilty on multiple counts. The judge in sentencing spoke scathingly of her calculated abuse of trust and callous disregard for the well-being of a vulnerable child and the financial integrity of the community she was elected to serve. She received a significant prison sentence, was ordered to pay hefty fines, and was mandated to make full restitution for the funds she had embezzled from the Oak Haven Glen HOA. Her assets, including her meticulously maintained home in Oak Haven Glen, were seized and sold to contribute towards this restitution. Her name became synonymous with HOA corruption and abuse of power. In Oak Haven Glen, the process of healing and rebuilding began almost immediately. The interim board, with overwhelming community support, initiated a complete overhaul of the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, stripping away the arbitrary and discriminatory rules Carmichael had implemented and replacing them with bylaws that emphasized fairness, transparency, and inclusivity. An independent auditing firm was hired to conduct a thorough review of all past financial transactions, and new robust financial controls were put in place to prevent future abuses. The community itself underwent a profound transformation. Freed from Carmichael's oppressive oversight, residents began to connect with one another in ways they hadn't before. Block parties were organized, a community garden was established, and neighbors started looking out for one another. The atmosphere of fear and suspicion was replaced by one of mutual respect and cooperation. Maya O'Connell's unfinished chalk sunflower on the driveway, which Liam had carefully photographed before it was eventually washed away by the rain, became an unintentional symbol of this renewal. The new HOA board, in one of its first acts, commissioned a local artist to paint a vibrant mural on a previously blank wall of the community clubhouse. A mural featuring a giant sunflower surrounded by children of all abilities playing together. It was dedicated to the spirit of community and the courage to bloom. The O'Connell family found their lives transformed as well. The cloud of harassment and anxiety that had overshadowed them for so long finally lifted. Maya, surrounded by a now supportive and understanding community, began to flourish. Her artistic talents blossomed and her confidence soared. She rejoined her school's art club, her laughter once again echoing through their home. The involuntary tics and vocalizations, while still a part of her condition, became less frequent, her stress levels significantly reduced. Liam's role in exposing Carmichael's corruption and his steadfast defense of his daughter earned him the deep respect and gratitude of his neighbors and commendation from his superiors at the police academy. He was even asked to consult with state legislators who were working on reforms to HOA laws to provide greater protection for homeowners against abuses of power. Chloe's advocacy organization gained new prominence, and she became a sought-after speaker on issues of disability rights and community inclusivity. Several months after Carmichael's conviction, Oak Haven Glen held its first community fair under the new HOA leadership. The atmosphere was joyful, a celebration of their newfound freedom and unity. Maya O'Connell was a guest of honor, invited to cut the ribbon for a new fully accessible playground that the community had funded and built in the Common Park area. A playground that included an adaptive swing, much like the one that had been the subject of Carmichael's early ire. As Liam and Chloe watched Maya, her face beaming with delight, soaring on the new swing, surrounded by a chorus of laughing children, they knew they had made the right decision to fight back. It had been a long and arduous battle, but they had not only secured justice for their daughter and their family, but had also helped to transform their neighborhood into the truly welcoming and supportive community they had always hoped it would be. The scars of their ordeal remained, but they were overshadowed by the profound sense of peace healing and the enduring power of a community united for good. Oak Haven Glen had finally truly become home,